On June 9, 2026, the U.S. government published a report that almost nobody reads, about a deadline almost everybody is counting on. The Social Security and Medicare trustees release this thing every year, and every year it says roughly the same thing in roughly the same tone. The money runs short eventually, here's the math, please do something. This year's version moved the date. Not by a lot, 1 year from 2033 to late 2032. But the reason it moved is the part worth sitting with. Not because more people retired than expected, not because the economy did something unusual. It moved because of a tax law passed the year before, one that quietly reduced how much revenue flows into the program that's already spending more than it takes in. Somebody adjusted a lever on one side of the machine, and the deadline on the other side got 6 years closer to arriving all at once. Sorry, 6 years closer than it was a decade ago, 1 year closer than last year's own estimate. This isn't really a story about Social Security's math, though we'll do the math. It's a story about what happens when a bill has been accumulating for 40 years, everyone in charge has known the invoice date, and the response, generation after generation, has been to reach for whichever lever moves the number furthest from an election cycle. Strip away the political noise and the mechanics here are genuinely simple. Simpler than most of what this show covers, which is exactly why the paralysis around fixing it is so revealing. Social Security runs on a pay-as-you-go structure. Today's workers' payroll taxes pay today's retirees' benefits, not their own future benefits sitting in an account somewhere. There's a trust fund, but it's less a savings account and more a buffer, accumulated when the program ran a surplus, now being drawn down because it's running a deficit. The Old Age and Survivors Insurance Fund, the part that actually pays retirement benefits, has had its costs exceed its income every year since 2010. Footnote 1. The 2026 Trustees report puts the number precisely. The OASI Trust Fund is now projected to deplete in the fourth quarter of 2032, 1 quarter earlier than last year's own projection. Footnote 2. When it depletes, the fund doesn't go to zero and stop paying. Ongoing payroll tax revenue keeps flowing in, just not enough to cover everything promised. Scheduled benefits would automatically drop to what current tax revenue actually supports. 78% of what's currently promised, cliff edge, the month the fund runs dry, absent congressional action. Footnote 3. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget translated that percentage into something a household budget can actually feel. An average monthly cut of roughly $500, with a loss running higher than that in 29 states, depending on regional benefit levels and cost of living variation. Footnote 4. For context, the average monthly retirement benefit for 2026 sits at $2,071. Footnote 5. A $500 monthly cut against that isn't a rounding error. It's closer to a quarter of the check, arriving automatically with no vote required to trigger it, only a vote required to prevent it. Here's the mechanism behind why this year's date moved specifically. The trustees' own chief actuary flagged in a letter accompanying the report that a 2025 tax law, one that reduced income taxation on Social Security benefits for many recipients, has material effects on the program's financing, because that same tax revenue was previously flowing back into the trust funds. Footnote 6. This is worth being precise about because it's an unusually clean illustration of a pattern this show keeps returning to. A policy that looks purely beneficial from one angle, retirees keeping more of their own benefit checks, has a second, less advertised effect on the exact structure that funds those checks in the first place. Nobody lied about this. It's simply the kind of trade-off that doesn't make it into the press release. It's worth noting what isn't broken here, because the honest version of this story has to hold both facts at once. The Disability Insurance Trust Fund, legally separate from the retirement fund, funded by the same payroll tax but tracked independently, is projected to remain fully solvent for the entire 75-year window the trustees model. Footnote 7. The crisis is specifically in the retirement half of the ledger, not the whole program, and combining the two funds administratively, something that would require an act of Congress, would push the combined depletion date out to 2034 and soften the immediate cut to 83% of benefits instead of 78%. Footnote 8. That's a real, available fix sitting on the table that requires no new revenue and no benefit reduction at all, just a legal merger of two accounting buckets that already draw from the same tax. It hasn't happened for the same reason nothing else on this list has happened. It would require Congress to act on Social Security by name in public before the deadline forces its hand. The scale of the long-run problem is worth one more number, because it reframes 1 year earlier from a rounding error into a trend line. The trustees now peg Social Security's 75-year funding gap at 4.42% of taxable payroll, up 16% from last year's estimate in a single annual revision. Footnote 9. That's not the kind of number that moves by 16% because of one policy tweak. It moves because the underlying demographic assumptions, how many workers, how many retirees, how long people live, keep getting revised in the same direction year after year, and each revision quietly makes next year's fix more expensive than this year's would have been. Widen the lens, and the pattern gets darker in a specific way. The US isn't early to this problem, and it isn't the country facing it hardest. It's arguably running behind. Japan has been living this reality for 3 decades. Over 30% of Japan's population is now 65 or older, and the country's April 2026 pension reform, raising the working pension earnings threshold from 500,000 yen to 620,000 yen per month, and extending IDA-co private pension eligibility to age 70, is fundamentally an attempt to keep older workers employed and contributing longer, because the arithmetic of a shrinking workforce supporting a growing retiree population no longer works any other way. Footnote 10. Japan's government pension investment fund has simultaneously begun shifting toward domestic assets, a move its finance minister frames as capturing economic growth, but one that also reads as a fund managing an aging beneficiary base with fewer options for the kind of higher risk, higher return positioning a younger fund might tolerate. Footnote 11. South Korea took the more direct route. Its National Pension Act reform, taking effect January 1, 2026 after 18 years without a major update, raises the contribution rate from 9 to 13%, split between employers and employees, phased in through 2033, while adjusting the benefit replacement rate to 43%. Footnote 12. That's the reform the U.S. hasn't been willing to attempt. A direct, visible, immediate increase in what workers pay in, timed specifically to a demographic cliff that Korea, with one of the lowest fertility rates in the developed world, is approaching faster than almost anywhere else. Here's the reframe that should reorder how you think about the U.S. situation specifically. America is demographically younger and structurally better positioned than Japan or Korea, has a trustees report giving it a 6-year runway before the automatic cut hits, and is still on track to let the deadline arrive without a legislated fix. The same failure mode Japan spent 30 years managing around and Korea just spent political capital avoiding outright. This isn't a story about America being uniquely broken. It's a story about a genuinely solvable problem that keeps getting deferred specifically because it's solvable later, right up until it isn't. There are exactly 4 conventional levers here, and Congress has had all 4 available and used for decades. Raise the payroll tax rate or the earnings cap. Currently, income above roughly $176,000 isn't subject to Social Security payroll tax at all. Raise or eliminate that cap, and a meaningful chunk of the shortfall closes. This shows up in every serious bipartisan proposal and gets attached to tax increase framing in every campaign ad, which is politically fatal regardless of which party proposes it. Cut benefits directly on a schedule Congress controls rather than an automatic cliff. This is the option nobody proposes out loud, because retirees vote at higher rates than almost any other demographic, and the candidate who cut your Social Security check is not a survivable general election label. Raise the retirement age further. Congress already did this once in 1983, the last time this exact crisis got this close to the edge, gradually raising full retirement age from 65 to 67. The demographic math has simply outrun that fix's shelf life, and raising it again lands hardest on workers in physically demanding jobs, who don't have the option of simply working 2 more years at a desk. Restructure the system entirely, means testing, partial privatization, some hybrid model. This is where ideology, not arithmetic, takes over. The last serious national attempt, in 2005, collapsed under its own political weight before reaching a vote, and nothing since has gotten closer. 4 levers, for decades, 0 legislated fixes, and the honest reason isn't that any of these options is technically hard. It's that the political cost of every option lands entirely on the politician who pulls it, while the cost of doing nothing lands on whoever happens to be in office when the automatic cut finally triggers. That's not the incumbent interest room from Episode 5, the mutual hostage room from Episode 8, the founding bargain room from Episode 9, or the relocated perimeter room from episodes 10 and 11. This is a different shape entirely. A pay-as-you-go system only works as long as each generation paying in is roughly as large as the one it's supporting. For 70 years, that assumption held. It doesn't anymore, and nobody had to do anything wrong for the arithmetic to stop working. It was only ever going to hold as long as the underlying population kept growing the way it did when the system was designed. Every door has a locked room behind it, and this one isn't hiding an incumbent, a hostage, a bargain, or a relocated risk. It's a chain letter, and the generation left holding it when the growth stops was never going to be the one that started it. There's a fifth lever, and it's conspicuously absent from the standard 4, not because it doesn't work but because naming it directly changes what kind of argument you're having. Every projection in this episode assumes something about future population growth, fertility rates, and net migration, because those numbers are literally load-bearing inputs in the actuarial model the trustees used to calculate a depletion date at all. Net migration is the one input in that model that can move faster than fertility rates or retirement age policy. A fertility rate shift takes 2 decades to show up in the workforce. A migration policy shift shows up within a single budget cycle. This is precisely why it's the most immediately consequential lever available to policymakers, and precisely why it's the most politically fraught one to discuss in the same breath as retirement solvency. Immigration policy carries an entirely separate, deeply contested political debate that has nothing to do with actuarial tables, and conflating the two rarely produces good policy or good politics. Both Japan and Korea, the two countries this episode already covered as further along this same demographic curve, have each begun cautiously loosening immigration and foreign worker policy specifically as a demographic offset measure, not a humanitarian one, which tells you something about how structurally serious the arithmetic gets before a historically closed immigration system starts treating openness as a fiscal necessity rather than a values debate. This is where the geopolitical layer actually connects back to the rest of this show's arc. A country's demographic trajectory isn't separate from its debt trajectory, its growth trajectory, or its geopolitical weight. Episode 3 already established what happens to a government's fiscal room when debt service starts crowding out everything else, and an aging population is a second, slower-moving version of exactly that same crowding out pressure, this time on the benefits side of the ledger instead of the interest payment side. China, the subject of this show's next major arc, is running the same demographic math on a much steeper curve, with a labor force that peaked years ago and a one-child policy legacy still working its way through the population pyramid, which is precisely why that episode earns its own full treatment rather than a paragraph here. Nothing in this episode is a surprise to anyone who's actually read a trustee's report. That's the uncomfortable part. This isn't a hidden crisis. It's a scheduled one with a date on it that the people responsible for preventing it have known about since roughly the Reagan administration. There's still a wider story here than the US can tell on its own, the country running the same demographic math at a scale and a speed that makes America's 6-year runway look almost comfortable by comparison. That's next.